Good morning and welcome to the Center for American Progress. We're going to get started shortly, but before we do, we ask that you please take your seats and silence all your cell phones. There will be a brief question and answer period at the end of this program. We ask that you state your name and affiliation prior to asking your brief question. Thanks.
Good afternoon, everyone. Oh, I'm going to be that guy, so let's try this one more time. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Center for American Progress. My name is Ed Chung. I'm the Vice President for Criminal Justice Reform here at CAP. Just to give you all a sense, if you don't know, of our program here at CAP, our focus and emphasis has been not only just to reform the criminal justice system, but our feeling is that, or not a feeling, our belief, backed by research, is that the criminal justice system has become way too large. And so we're here to help try to shrink the system and also to change the narrative that the system should not be the default response for policymakers who are looking to solve problems in society. So if you want to learn more about what we do, please visit our website at americanprogress.org. Also, our Twitter handle is at @SmartOnCrimeUS, at @SmartOnCrimeUS. First, let me apologize for my voice. You didn't come to hear me, by the way, so I'm going to keep this short, but I apologize for my voice nonetheless. There's a lot going on in Washington this week. We're not going to get into anything that's happening or important votes or anything like that, but we're reminded every single day that elections matter. And elections matter at the national level in this area because we have two attorney generals who were appointed by someone who was elected that is really trying to fight reforms going across the country now, that are pushing back against what people are trying to do to change their communities and to reform the criminal justice system. But elections matter not only at the national level. For this issue of criminal justice reform, elections at the local level matter the most. And whether it's for sheriff, who police our counties and run our jails, whether it's for judges who preside over criminal cases, or whether it's for prosecutors who decide which cases to pursue and who to charge, those local elections matter the most. And for the majority of this country, all three of those positions are decided by the vote and the will of the people. Prosecutors, as many of you know, are considered to be the most powerful actors in the criminal justice system. At their best, prosecutors are gatekeepers to make sure that the interests of justice are served, not only to pursue and obtain the most convictions or the harshest and most severe penalties possible. If you look at all of the major issues, or at least most of the major issues that's plaguing the criminal justice system now, you can see the hand of the prosecutor influencing them in one way or the other. Whether it's a number of people convicted, disparities in who is prosecuted, lengths of sentences, fairness, transparency, due process, all of these are at least influenced by the prosecutor and at most controlled by what the prosecutor does. That's why it's important to have reform-minded leaders at the head of a prosecutor's office. Over the past 5-7 years or so, voters in localities across the country have taken a much closer look at these races as they have sought to align their goals of ending mass incarceration with candidates who prioritize reforming a broken justice system. And reform-minded prosecutors have been taking office across the country. It's been slow, the product of a lot of hard work on the ground by a lot of dedicated members of the community, but the trajectory is heading up. And it's not only happening in big cities like San Francisco and Chicago and Philadelphia. In 2019, we saw it happen in 3 counties right across the river here in Virginia. And so we're privileged today to have 3 Commonwealth's attorneys elect, it's a mouthful to say, with us today, along with a terrific moderator. And soon, that elect part will be coming off of their titles, if it hasn't been already. Buda Bibarai is the Commonwealth Attorney elect for Loudoun County. She's practiced as a trial attorney in Loudoun County for over 25 years, as a substitute judge for over 11 years. She's prosecuted and defended thousands of civil and criminal cases on all levels of the state court. Buda spent her entire career helping families, children, and clients with problems that required experience, sensitive, and solutions-based approaches. The ultimate goal being to address core root issues of the matter, provide support systems, and prevent repeat incidents of crisis. Buda was born in Montenegro, is of Albanian parentage. She graduated from George Mason University with a BS in education and received her JD from the George Mason University School of Law. We won't say what that was renamed to later on. Steve Toscano is a Commonwealth Attorney-elect for Fairfax County. He's a West Point grad, former U.S. Army helicopter pilot. Following his time as an Army officer, Steve went to law school at Temple, where he graduated earning honors as a member of the Temple Law Review and a fellow in Temple University's Public Interest Law Honor Society. He spent the next 6 years as a federal prosecutor at the U.S. Department of Justice, first as a special assistant to the U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District of Virginia, and later as a trial attorney both in the Criminal Tax Division and the Consumer Protection Branch. In 2016, Steve moved on from the Justice Department, becoming the Chief Operating Officer and General Counsel at Paragon Autism Services. He's also a member of the prominent Fairfax County Police Civilian Review Panel, the oversight body tasked with conducting civilian oversight of the county police department. Parissa Dagani-Tafti has a 20-year record of working to reform the criminal justice system before her election to become Commonwealth's Attorney for Arlington County. She was a public defender, litigating cases of systemic and constitutional issues, advocating for the elimination of race, class, and gender bias in criminal proceedings, and obtaining the first DNA exoneration in Washington, D.C., which led to the discovery of false testimony by an FBI analysis, resulting in the FBI reviewing thousands of other past cases. Parissa was also the legal director of an innocence protection organization, which worked to exonerate individuals wrongfully convicted of crimes they did not commit. She came to the United States as a child with her parents and graduated from the University of California, Berkeley with a BA in philosophy and comparative literature, and from the NYU School of Law, where she obtained her JD. She's lived in Arlington for the past 12 years with her husband, a civil rights lawyer and a law professor at Georgetown University Law Center, and their 2 children. And we have the pleasure of having this panel moderated by Josie Duffy Rice, a journalist and lawyer whose work is primarily focused on prosecutors, prisons, and other criminal justice issues. Currently, she is the president of The Appeal, a news publication that publishes original journalism about the criminal justice system. Josie co-hosts the podcast Justice in America with Clint Smith, which everybody should subscribe, download, rate 5 stars. I've been told to say that about podcasts. Her work has been cited by the New York Times, the New Yorker, the Atlantic, Slate, among others. Previously, she was staff writer at the Daily Kos, where she covered prosecutors and criminal justice. She's also the co-founder and former editor-in-chief of 7 Scribes, a website that features essays, fiction, interviews, investigative journalism, and cultural analysis by young writers of color. Josie's a graduate of Harvard Law School, received her bachelor's degree from Columbia. She comes to us from Atlanta, Georgia, where she lives with her husband and son. If you all will join me in welcoming our terrific panel.
Thank you so much, Ed. That was a great intro. I forgot some of that stuff about me. So thank you so much. And thank you guys so much for coming. And I'm so excited to be here. I have to tell you all that when I started covering prosecutors, which was about like 4 or 5 years ago, there was never any good news. And it was there was plenty of stuff to cover, but none of it was ever good. And so it was a tough job, and I did not expect to see so much change so fast, and I'm so excited to be sitting here with you all. This is great. I was going to introduce you all, but I did such a great job. I can't meet that level. So I'm going to actually ask you all to start by talking a little bit about why you wanted to run for a Commonwealth's Attorney, and why now.
Well, my background is as a prosecutor. And the reason that I first became a prosecutor is one of the motivating set of values that caused me to run for this particular office. I became a prosecutor because of something that I learned from my father a long, long time ago when I was a middle schooler. My dad was somebody who didn't go to college, who worked, a manual labor job for decades. And when the idea of me becoming a lawyer was broached, I'll never forget what he told me. What he told me was that although a lot of things in this world are set up to take advantage of the everyday person, the one area where everybody could get a fair shake, no matter their color, your skin, how much money you make, where you live, is in the law. And then if you become an attorney, you can work justice, and that's a noble thing to do. And that's actually why I became an attorney, why I became a prosecutor, to try to work justice. And unfortunately, what I saw during my time as a prosecutor was that there were disparities. there are disparities based on the color of someone's skin, their background, what their education was, where they lived, how much money they had. And that bothered me significantly. And also, I heard that those stories, those same things were happening in Fairfax County, which to people who live in Fairfax County, they would have been shocked at. But I peeled back the onion, and I continued to see that, and I saw those inequities. And the reason I ran for the position was to build a system that treats everybody fairly, regardless of who they are, where they come from, what their status is. And I think the people of Fairfax County deserve that, because we had only had 2 Commonwealth's attorneys in over 52 years. And if you know anything about Fairfax County, you know that it is a dynamic place. It has changed dramatically, not only in the last 2 years, the last 5 years, certainly in the last 52 years, and we had a criminal justice system that simply did not keep pace. That's part of the reason I ran. The people of Fairfax County deserve a criminal justice system that reflects their values and what they need today, not in the mid-'60s. And then also, I think it's important to realize that as part of this greater progressive prosecutor movement, we've seen that take hold in the big urban cities that Ed mentioned, Philadelphia, Chicago, LA. But if it's really going to thrive and survive, it needs to move out of the cities and in the suburban jurisdictions. So a place like Fairfax County with 1.2 million residents, it's bigger than 8 states, it's bigger than DC. It's dynamic. It is the economic engine of Virginia. And if the movement is going to survive and spread around the country, it needs to take hold in places like Fairfax County. That's why I thought it was important to run at this particular time.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming. Thank you, Josie. Thank you, Cap. So my background is as a public defender and an innocence attorney. And I decided to go to law school because a good friend of mine was convicted of a crime that he didn't commit while we were in college. And I went to law school knowing that I was going to work on wrongful convictions, and I did for 18 years. And what I noticed in working on these wrongful convictions was that a lot of people were innocent who were convicted, and that was wrong. But even in cases where I couldn't tell if somebody was innocent, and cases where somebody clearly was not innocent, I was seeing a lot of the same systemic issues over and over again, whether that's ineffective defense counsel, whether that's withholding Brady material, and eyewitness ID issues, false confessions. And I realized, as I was thinking about sort of what was happening in my own backyard, that I had spent a lot of time sort of plucking people out individually, like that parable goes at the bottom of the river. But maybe it was time for me to start walking upriver and seeing how this was happening to begin with, and whether I could stop it or not. And so I started thinking about what I could do to fix it and what I could do to walk upstream. And I'm not saying this in any sort of like I'm kissing up to you way, but Josie, Justice in America was really, I had been thinking since about February 2018 about running, and there were things that I was seeing in my jurisdiction that were continuing to bother me. And I've been talking to people and sitting down and really sort of building support, and also figuring out what exactly was going on in my jurisdiction. And my husband and I and the kids were on a 4-hour drive, and we listened to a bunch of episodes of Justice in America, and this was August now, on the way there. And then I insisted that we listen to the same episodes on the way back. And my husband was like, "Didn't you hear it the first time?" And there were a few things that stuck out to me, and it was really sort of the John Pfaff episode, the Alexandra Navitov episode, where she talks about the wrongful convictions that happen on misdemeanor levels, and how what we've done is we've widened the net, and that nobody pays attention to all of these people who plead to something because they were overcharged, and because they get out, they get time served, and their cases aren't exciting anymore. They're not the people who got the life in prison. And then the moment that there was a moment where Ta-Nehisi Coates is on the show, and I can't remember who said it, but he says that our system is a mass incarceration machine set on autopilot. And I turned around to my husband and said, I have to run, right? And that's exactly what we have in every single jurisdiction in the United States. And it's not just we put a lot of people in prison. It's that we put a lot of people in contact with the criminal justice system that ends up creating lifelong consequences. And one of those examples that was happening in Arlington is you don't go to jail for your first time marijuana possession offense in Arlington. You don't go to jail because the prosecutor would take jail off of the table. But you know what happens then? You lose your right to counsel. So then a bunch of people were getting misdemeanor marijuana possession convictions with no ability to speak to a lawyer about it. So of course that creates the inequities between the rich and the poor. And what was happening then was that they were then going to be closed off from educational opportunities because you can't get Pell Grants, you can't get federal housing assistance. Then they were going to get closed off to the primary job market, to getting any kind of security clearance. And what happens the next time something happens is that they now have a record. And so maybe they won't go to jail the second time they're possessing marijuana, but at some point they're going to end up in prison because they have all of these little things that nobody was able to consult with them about. They become deportable and excludable, but nobody was there to tell them that that's what was going to happen to them. And that's ultimately why I decided to run. And I'm not going to lie, the path had been laid out by the appeal, by Justice in America, by scholars and activists who'd spent a good 2 decades building the narrative for us to run on and building the data sets for us to run on. And so, I'm incredibly grateful to, I call him Daniel, because that's how I know him. But
The Canyon, yeah.
Exactly.
Don't feel bad. I call them the same thing.
I just, but and in that, to give credit to him, when we would talk about, when I would get interviewed, what would happen is that you'd see like a snippet or two, a paragraph or two about something, but he was the person who dove sort of most deeply and reflected what our views were most deeply, and who has really set up a robust conversation about what the reform prosecutors actually think.
Good afternoon. I came by way of choosing to run. Really, it seems to be like a quarter of a century in the process, and I just didn't know it. But I remember when I first came out of law school, my idea was that I was going to be a trial attorney. I was going to change the world. And then when you put out in the streets of the law, you realize, wow, the world is pretty daggone big. So I shrunk my world to my community, which was Loudoun County. And I had the benefit of being able to work with the citizens of Loudoun County as they were able to kind of maneuver themselves through the criminal justice system. And you can be very impactful as a defense attorney. I mean, this is where you literally are holding the hands of the individuals who are being charged, who are going through the system. And if you could get them a lesser charge, a lesser sentence, a lesser impact, then you feel like you've done well, and you have done. That's a win. So you fast forward 15 years, I start then substitute judging, and I'm starting to see cases come before me that before it was anecdotally that, wait a second, why is somebody dealing with my kid a little bit differently with these set of facts or this background versus how they dealt with another one of my kids or young emerging adults and with similar facts. But when you see it, when you're a judge and you've got it in the same afternoon and you have the same prosecutor who's dealing or providing different outcomes, then it becomes very clear that there is a huge disparity in the system. So it's not just your anecdotal experience where you feel like that was my kid, my client, but now you're starting to see it across the board, and it made me much more mindful of the fact as to what are we doing with the system. I also pulled a stint with the Public Defender's Office in 2000 to 2002 and saw that from a volume perspective as far as the resources that are provided by the system. I hated the limited amount of time that I had as a public defender because I had, literally you had a docket or you had a caseload of 50, 60, 70 cases. So you are, I'm going to say smarter as a public defender than you are as a private attorney only because you're dealing with volume and you're able to issue spot very quickly, but you don't have the capacity to be able to deal with the other issues that your client has. So I go back into private practice, and that was my first goal is, what we're going to do is we're going to fix for our clients the issues. What brought you here? Rare is it the time that it is a single incident that brings you before the criminal justice system. It's a progression. It could be how you were raised. It could be your financial situation. It could be your educational. It could be your immigration status. All these things impact what happens. So then when you then have that charge, what are we doing to fix it? Can we process you? Sure. And that's where I saw that the criminal justice system on the behalf of the prosecutors was they were processing. It's check a box and here it is, next. Check a box, next. Here, check a box, next. But we were, as defense attorneys, were being left with the aspect that how's that impacting my client? And then just as importantly, how's it impacting my community? Because if I had a client who's being sent to prison, where was his family? That might have been the wage earner in that household that provided predominantly for that family. Where was the parent? Because now I have a kid who may have one or no parents in the household. So we're creating these generational impacts that nobody's stopping saying, what is the impact to our community? So if you don't care a lick about my client who's been accused of having done something wrong, that's fine. But you better start caring about what's happening to his neighbors, to his family, to the community as far as even employment purposes, because that's when it's impacting everybody. And then this conversation, we start talking about the impact of criminal justice, became very exciting because it was no longer a conversation that you had with your defense attorneys over a drink or two, and you're like, oh my God, the system is so unfair, and let's talk about it, and we kind of gripe about it. It then became a conversation that we were having with everyone saying, how is it impacting us? 2016 happens. The elections were very devastating. And most importantly, what it made me feel was very powerless to think, like, how did we get here? And then you start seeing what's going on in our system. You realize maybe I can't change that level, but I sure as heck can change my local level. I started thinking about running at that point, and then I started paying greater attention just to the conversation on a national level and realizing that there is some traction, there is some general interest across the nation as far as us wanting to do this differently so that we could get it right. I had a case that I read in the paper. It wasn't even my case. Guy gets charged with stealing some tires, and he steals them from 6 cars to feed his drug addiction. And you look at his history, stealing, drug conviction, stealing, drug conviction, stealing, drug conviction. I'm not the smartest person in the room, but I even could figure out that solution. It's a daggone drug addiction issue. So what do we do? And he comes to our community. The prosecutor stacks up charges, hits him with 18 felonies, puts it before a jury. A jury makes a recommendation of 132 years. The judge has got the last deciding, the judge makes the last decision regarding the sentence. His guidelines, in Virginia we have what are called guidelines that are just advisory, discretionary. They don't have to apply them, but they just want you to consider them as a judge. The judge fills out the sentencing order and says, I didn't follow the jury's recommendations because it was too high. Guidelines are 2 to 4 years. The judge doesn't apply that sentencing range, but instead gives him 17 active years to serve for stealing tires for a drug addiction. I'm a businesswoman and I'm a taxpayer. So what I've stood on is the fact that that decision and decisions like that are stealing from me as a member of the community. You just took $475,000 from my tax base to put somebody in jail who maybe if we spent maybe 10% of that and get him to a program, he could remain with his family, he remains in his community, and then just as importantly, he starts contributing to my tax base. He starts helping me pay for my schools and for law enforcement and counseling. So how about we start being smarter on crime rather than just being this idea that what we're going to do is we're going to be tough on crime? There's nothing wrong with being tough on crime. We just can't be stupid on crime. And that's what I saw the system was doing in my community, and I decided that, you know what, I was hopeful that somebody else would choose to run because my life was very comfortable. I had a successful practice. I loved doing the sub-judging. I loved being able to do things in my community. And I couldn't find somebody that I thought would be able to give a challenge to the current, at that time, the current prosecutor who'd been in office for almost 16 years. So I decided to go in there because I had nothing to lose. I was very comfortable, but my community was not comfortable. And I decided to rattle some cages and come up there and just be fearless in saying, let's do things right. And the best thing about the conversation was people were engaged. You would talk to people, they're like, why is that not common sense? So that's from a common sense perspective, and a community investment is why I chose to run.
Thank you all. So I was going to ask you some questions about policy, but I actually think that that is something people can find out online if they want, and we should talk about some things that they maybe can't find out online if they want. So I thought we'd talk a little bit about the obstacles you all have faced, and obviously you all ended up victorious, but we know that there are a lot of races where people who have progressive platforms don't win, and we know that there are a lot of both systemic and sort of societal obstacles standing in the way of prosecutors who say, I want to do things differently. I'd love to hear from each of you just a little bit, you know, not every obstacle, but maybe just a couple that you faced, so that I think the audience can understand what the landscape looks like for people who are trying to get into this work, and then we'll talk a little bit about the press.
Well, I won't give you every single obstacle because we only have so much time in the day. And even if we each picked a different obstacle, I'm sure there'll be many, many more out there that we can talk about, because it was, this is a very challenging role to run for. Really the biggest obstacle, or the one that I'll focus on, is one that I'm sure that we've all seen, which is some combination of voters not knowing that this position exists, not understanding what it does, how powerful it can be, or quite simply not caring about it. I know that in our race, I announced my run for Commonwealth's Attorney in November of last year. So I ran this race for over a year, through a primary and through a general election. And we made a very conscious decision, particularly during the first six months of the race, to run around the county of 1.2 million people, and essentially to educate people on this position did. Because I was pretty much at the stage I'm running for Commonwealth's Attorney, and I look at the blank, I tell by face, no idea what I'm talking about. And people go, yeah, I go, you never heard of Commonwealth's Attorney before, have you heard of the district attorney? And some people heard of the district attorney. And a big part of the stump speech or voter engagement was explaining what this role can do. Right? Because a lot of people, once they know the role exists, they think, well, isn't being a prosecutor, you're just following rules that somebody set out. You don't really do anything. It's kind of this ministerial job. Quite frankly, you could probably get a robot to do. And that's simply not the case. So educating people and letting them know about the immense discretion that a prosecutor has, how they are the most powerful actor, more so than the police or judges or anyone in the entire criminal justice system, and how that with the right policies and the right leadership, the person who is your elected Commonwealth's Attorney, your elected prosecutors, can make a difference in the lives of so many people, which in turn would make a difference in entire communities, even in a county of 1.2 million people. So I think from my perspective, the biggest obstacle was engaging people, educating them, because once, as Buda said, once people understood, then they got very on board with this of, well, of course I want a criminal justice system that aligns with my values. Of course I want one that is looking to help members of our community and invest in juveniles and do all these things. The biggest obstacle was letting people know that the way to do that was to elect a Commonwealth's Attorney who shared their values.
So I think the biggest challenge that we face is the growing narrative in pretty extreme circles that trying to reimagine the criminal legal system is somehow going to make us less safe, that it somehow disrespects victims, and that it also disrespects law enforcement. And, and sort of the trying to pull in the notion that prosecutors have discretion, because prosecutors had plenty of discretion when they were white men trying to make the system more harsh. I mean, that's the truth. Prosecutors had discretion, and they were allowed to exercise it. But now that we are getting prosecutors who want to talk about reform, who are saying, look, the system isn't broken. It's functioning exactly how it was supposed to function, and that is wrong. And what that's done is created an incredibly inequitable society, and that we have to understand the system in both its historical terms, but also in terms of what is the best available social science data. Now that we're saying that, and now that the face of prosecutors is different, and we're saying we need to reimagine the system, all of a sudden prosecutor discretion is very, very bad, and prosecutors don't have discretion anymore and shouldn't have discretion. And so I think those are the two things that that are, and they're philosophical. I mean, there are going to be practical obstacles. I mean, setting up, one of the most important things to me in my passion project is setting up a restorative justice system in Arlington. I'm under no illusion that that's going to be something that happens in a few months or even a year. It's going to be slow. You know, we have this incredibly antiquated discovery non-system in Virginia, whereby you're not even entitled to your own police, like the police reports in your own case, if you're a defendant. And so we have to figure out how to get, I mean, other jurisdictions in the country have figured it out, but you know, the three of us have to figure out how to get discovery to defense attorneys in a timely fashion. So there's going to be practical issues, but I think that the hardest piece is going to be combating this narrative that wants to, you know, as soon as women of color and as soon as people who are trying to reimagine the mass incarceration machine and trying to change its direction show up, that suddenly now, well, discretion is not a good thing and discretion is dangerous. And, you know, we're working on it, but it's the biggest problem.
Similar to what Parissa was just saying, as far as, I will just rephrase it differently from my perspective, is this. We need to change the culture within the criminal justice system. And that really is because I think prosecutors have come away from what is their job. And for many, it was singularly listed as to prosecute, to punish to the fullest extent of the law. And when you look at that, that sounds pretty reasonable, right? Because it keeps our community safe and it makes sure that the people are punished and on and on and on until you stop and you start listening, you start looking at the impact and you're like, well, that's just craziness. Because it doesn't have that impact. It doesn't have that result. What we end up doing is if we don't change the culture in these offices by saying your job as a prosecutor is to do justice. Okay, so safety and justice are not opposite statements or opposite goals. Safety equals justice. Justice will equal safety. So how we end up needing to do that is we have to, in my opinion, is we're going to have to combat the money issue. Because if we are able to reduce the imprint of criminal justice system, what is it going to do? It's going to cause us to need fewer probation officers because we are now only using probation officers for cases that services are going to be provided rather than putting everyone as a default on probation. And having sentences for 5 years hanging over somebody's head for a case that a judge would not maybe require them to do 3 months of jail. So why do we have 5 years? Because it's a trap. It's not a success-oriented system. It's a failure-oriented system because, aha, I got you. Again, I don't know what win that is for the community, but I don't see it with that lens. The other part that we end up doing as far as changing the culture is within law enforcement because, again, they're thinking that's what we want to do is we want to catch people who have broken the law. Now you need to be able to take them to court and have that consequence. So what we have to do is change their mindset to say this. What is the harm? First of all, what is the crime that's been committed? What is the harm to the community? And then how much do we need to do to consequence somebody to get them to comply? If anyone here has multiple kids, if you have, and I'm going to take 3 kids because that's a nice average number. You might have one kid, if you give them the dad or mom eye, they buckle. They're just straight up. The other one might have to have the dad voice saying you need to do this, and they buckle. The other one, you might have to take them out to the shed and what is that switch from the old days? Because I come from the city, we don't have switches. But anyway, that's the thing is where you might have to have a more severe consequence because that's what is needed to be able to get the compliance. Not everybody should be subjected to the switch. And that's how our criminal justice system has been. How can we go ahead and get people to comply? And the only way we can do that is by incarcerating. And that really is not the answer, so we have to change the culture.
I am definitely the parent where my kid does not do anything when I give him the look, so that speaks to me. One of the obstacles I think all of you have talked about and faced to some extent is the press, right? And how local press can sometimes cover issues like progressive prosecutors and how tough it is. I mean, in defense of journalists, how tough it is to have the resources and the background to cover some of these issues. I think prosecutorial discretion is a great example of a place where you can see sometimes where local press is skeptical of prosecutorial discretion when they're not. And some of that is just not having the same sort of background that lawyers have, et cetera. So I'd love to hear you all talk about your experiences running, the coverage you got locally primarily, and how that affected your campaign, whether that was an obstacle or sort of a boon to your campaign.
I might have the shortest answer, so I'm going to do this. We didn't get a lot of coverage out in Loudoun County. And that's because there was a whole lot of hoopla going on in Fairfax and Arlington. So we were the quiet kids.
Welcome.
And yes, and I definitely benefited from that because we have a lot of similar issues on our platforms and hopes and aspirations. But they definitely did have the greater battle. In my community, once I started to run, the person who I was running against then ended up becoming elevated to a judgeship, and then his chief deputy took over. And early on, her position was that she now was going to tout herself as being progressive. Look at these programs I have. Look what I've done. Why do we need to have change? Which was totally 180 degrees opposite of what the reality was, which is like coming to the courthouse to see what really goes on. But so we didn't get a lot of local play. Now the appeal had done an article on this, a position on mine, and my whole one was similar to what I said earlier, which is stop stealing my resources. With the criminal justice system, we keep locking people up. You're stealing our resources, and we can't provide the services. So that was a great opportunity for me to be able to start promoting what really my theory was as to how we wanted to run our criminal justice system in Loudoun. But we didn't have a whole lot of that. And how did it play? We were just kind of like the quiet kids in the neighborhood.
We, as Buda mentioned, my race happened to get a lot of press. Very shocking, of course. But it was really interesting because we got press from a number of different outlets, and even the same reporters from the same outlet. And what I saw was a wide range of reaction to what I was trying to do. There were some people who were, for whatever reason, maybe the reporting they had done or what their personal views were, that were they understood it. They got it, right? They were tapped into the community. They understood what I was trying to do, and we got very favorable coverage from those individuals. There were other individuals who were, no matter what I had said, their view of the world was such that I was going to be that, like Marissa mentioned earlier, everything that we were trying to do was disrespectful to victims or law enforcement, or we were trying to do something extrajudicial that we shouldn't be doing. But I found that most of the people kind of fell in between those two extremes, where reporters who covered us, not that they were skeptical of what I was trying to do or the things that I was saying, but that their heuristic, their view of the criminal justice system was so set from years and years of what it had been, that their starting point was necessarily from what had existed in Fairfax County for decades and decades and decades. And what was really, really interesting to me was that within that group, that changed over time. As we had more conversations with people, as I put out a 20-page document on white paper on what I wanted to accomplish in the office, and as that made the rounds and people could understand the arguments, that coverage started to change. And I will say that from the major outlets, as that coverage started to change from not understanding to somewhat skeptical to taking an objective look, that actually buoyed my campaign somewhat, where people could pick up the Washington Post or they go on TV and they could see an article that was, even just calling it straight down the middle, was beneficial, I think, for us, because quite frankly, we're on the right side of history here when it comes to what our criminal justice system should be. So it is an obstacle, but I found that, and it hurt in the beginning, but as we got our message out and our message became more fairly covered, more widely covered, it actually became a boon to our campaign, because people would even say, "Oh, you're getting better coverage from the Post now. They must be understanding what you're trying to do." So it's like many other things, it's a process. I wish every news outlet was the Appeal, because they were on board from day one, but unfortunately that is not the world that we live in.
I want to just say, after this, we're going to have question and answer, so I want to let Marissa answer, but I would do this for a couple more hours if we had the time, but I think you guys probably have other stuff to do.
So I think I touched on this a little bit with my answer earlier, and sort of why I ran, and I found the same. I hadn't thought about it in terms of the progression that Steve had just described, but I think that's right. I think people started with, at least local outlets started with not really being tuned into what the prosecutor does, and that's largely because there hasn't been a lot of transparency. And so you had to work really, really hard to figure out what prosecutors do and the amount of discretion they have and what actually goes on in the courtroom and data. I mean, nobody was looking at any data in terms of news outlets. And I think I think being so close to DC and the national sort of news and having like the Post be one of our local papers helped in the sense of getting the message out really widely. And I'm going to just agree that every outlet should be like the Appeal, because again, I would talk to people and I would have like a 40-minute interview, and there would be 2 paragraphs. And when I talked to Daniel, he reproduced almost verbatim our entire conversation, and really got the subtleties of what my positions were out, like the whole notion that people should not only get their voting rights back once they're released, but when we talked, I said, look, people shouldn't lose their voting rights to begin with, and here are the 3 reasons why. And he was great about reproducing that. And so having organizations nationally that will delve into the issues and follow like every single prosecutor is just really a blessing.
We are trying to clone Daniel at the Appeal. We need like 8 Daniels. Great. So if anybody has any questions, raise your hand. We have a mic for you.
Attorney, and I know many of you on the stage. One of the things that I'm really worried about as a practitioner, having been in each of your jurisdictions, is change is hard and no good deed goes unpunished. And are you all equipped with a system in place that will keep your sort of ideas and focus throughout your term? Not only for yourselves, but also for your boots on the ground, which are going to be your assistants who are trying to manage this change in jurisdictions where change feels almost impossible.
Thanks for the really tough question, Lavonda. Geez. That really is the challenge that we have, is because you have people who don't quite buy into what we're trying to do. And honestly, at least my perspective is they're just waiting for the screw up. And oh my gosh, you had 99 great opportunities to have great results, and then there was one mishap. That's just the reality of the risk that we take. So what we have to just be able is to continue the education part of it. Why is this us being on the right side of history? So do we have a support system in place? I'll speak for my county. It's been a struggle trying to make sure that we get the right players in, and I mentioned it to somebody in our human resources. I said, I want to have the right people on my team. It's like a basketball game, right? If I don't have the right players on my team, and they don't know what my coaching style is, or they don't know what my plays are, then I'm not going to be able to be successful. No offense, if I'm not successful, my county's not successful. So you should be invested in me and what I'm trying to bring, because this is what the people voted. That's what we're here for. We're here to represent what their interests are, what their wants are, so stop fighting me. Now, it's a struggle. It hasn't been day one yet, but we'll figure this out in January. But my intent is to have a sustainable system in place, because otherwise, no offense, it's a, flash in the pan, is that the phrase? Where it's just here today, gone tomorrow. We don't want to do that. We want to actually have this where we get rooted into some of these systemic changes so that people actually could start seeing, wow, that was why it was so daggone wrong in the past. But that is what is the hope we have, is that we'll be given the opportunity to root what we want to do and let it flourish.
I mean, I think systemically all of us have plans in the office to start collecting data and analyzing it, and to really show our work, and show how our policies are beneficial, and to follow the data to see what policies are beneficial and how we have to adjust. So we're all pretty committed to that. And not governing by anecdote, right? Trying to make sure that we don't do what we've done in the past 50 years, which is, react to one story when the data shows that is 1 out of 100. And I think, getting the right team in place is really important, making sure that everybody has buy-in, and that you articulate as a leader what your vision is clearly. And personally, what I've done, I mean, a lot of what I had a great job, like Buda. I had my dream job, and I'd worked really hard to get my dream job. And the reason why I did this was because of a deep commitment that I have to really trying to sort of bring my philosophical views into reality. And so for me, I'm grounded, and I talk a lot about John Rawls and trying to fashion a system behind the veil of ignorance, and trying to create a system that you would be willing to be involved in, no matter whether you were rich or poor, black or white, and that doesn't depend on the dollars in your bank account and who you love and who you don't love and what citizenship papers you hold or don't hold. So for me, that's something, that, and I got sworn in on my law school copy of A Theory of Justice last night. So for me, it runs deep, but I've also written letters to myself that I'm giving to my family members, so that if they see me change and if they hear me change, they can just give me the letters to remind me, who I am and why I did this. And so I've put that in place personally. And I think we're all really lucky that we are a part of a national movement, and we do have media outlets and organizations that are bringing us together and providing support system and providing sort of educational opportunities and providing sounding boards, but also, keeping checks to make sure that, we each other keep ourselves honest, so to speak.
LaVonda, I really appreciate that question, because it is a struggle. It is hard. And while I am maybe not the poetic soul that Parissa is, I didn't write myself any letters. But what I did do, and I did this intentionally, is that 20-page white paper, all backed up by footnotes that I put out early in my campaign. I wrote that not only so that the people of Fairfax knew what they were voting for, and that I could hold that up in meetings and say, there's no mistake. The people want this, and we're going to do this. But to have that as a touchstone in the office. That is going to be the foundational document of our office. Every person who comes to work for me in Fairfax County is going to have read it, understood it, and they're going to have to implement it. A big part of that is making sure that we have the right leadership. It's no secret that I've remade my entire leadership team, not just with great attorneys, but with great attorneys who share the values of the county and share the vision that we're trying to bring to this office. We're going to try to institutionalize those values through written policies that we're going to demand compliance with. Right now, that office of Fairfax County, which serves 1.2 million people, might shock you that an office that important has no written policies. Things are willy-nilly. We're not going to have that anymore. We're going to write policies so that people know what their job is and what they're supposed to do. And then the last thing, which doesn't get as much play as, say, a written policy does, but one way you can really institutionalize things is how you structure your office. And that's one of the things I'm really, really focused on, structuring the office in a way that we institutionalize the changes. A great example that I'm very excited to take a look at is Fairfax County does not have a dedicated juvenile section right now. What happens is prosecutors, they cycle in on a daily basis every 2 or 3 weeks. And what happens there is that our people in juvenile court, the area where we can really turn a life around fully, where we should be investing so much of our money, not only for that kid, but for their family today and tomorrow, for the safety and the betterment of our community, is severely, it's shortchanged. It's an afterthought in Fairfax County. So one of the things that I want to do to institutionalize that change is to change the structure of the office so that even if something would happen to me, the structure is there so that the investments that we made, the priorities that we made, are cemented in the way that the office is set up.
Hi, Josh Rovner. I'm with the Sentencing Project. I do a lot of state-level advocacy work, and I think I have a similar concern to what we just heard, and it's about making these changes permanent. As great as you may be, and we all hope that you will be great at your jobs, when we do state-level advocacy, we often find that the prosecutors are on the opposite side of whatever common sense reforms are out there. And I'd really like to know what your priorities are in Richmond. Decriminalizing disorderly conduct in schools is something that's moving. You have lousy confidentiality laws. 14-year-olds who can be tried as adults by your own discretion or by automatic transfer. And I'm wondering which of those priorities you're willing to work with us to see change statewide so we don't have justice by geography. And when you move on to your next job and your successor takes over, so that these changes are permanent for all the kids in the Commonwealth.
This
mean,
relates, I think, a little bit to the conversation we had about the DA Association as well.
Right. So I completely agree with you. I mean, it's great for us individually to be doing what we're going to be doing, but we need Richmond, and we need to make these changes on a statewide and level. And I'm talking about discovery. I'm talking about not certifying, not having, not trying kids as adults. Getting rid of mandatory minimums, making the crime commission a criminal justice reform commission. And so, those are things that I support. I've been in touch with my legislators and other legislators. And, Steve and I both sit on the board of the Virginia Association of Commonwealth Attorneys. And, we're not going to be silent in the face of these. And so we're going to try to move the association. But also we have the freedom as individuals to still lobby and testify and to advocate for the changes that to sort of, I guess, really cement the changes that we're talking about and to make them on a statewide basis. And I think all of us have every intention of doing that for the issues that we ran on.
Yeah, and I would add on to that. It's one of the things that I talked about a lot in my campaign was that, not only would I be setting the policy for Fairfax County, but people listen to their Commonwealth's attorney. Legislators do. I've talked to our state senators, our state delegates, and what I've heard time and time again is that these individuals are interested in getting a different view of criminal justice, but they haven't had a partner in these important offices to have those conversations with. And that's something that I committed to, and I think we've all committed to working with those legislators to come up with bills and to support bills that will make more permanent a view of criminal justice that I think everyone in this room, certainly everyone on the stage, would really like to take hold in Virginia. I would say the problem with the Prosecutors Association is every prosecutor gets one vote. I represent about 15% of Virginia's population, but I get the same vote as someone who represents, a couple thousand people. I think up on the stage we got 25%, 22%, something like that of all of Virginia represented here, but we're only 3 votes. So, but we are committed.
3 out of 120.
3 out of 120, exactly. But we are committed to pushing VACA towards a view of criminal justice that the Virginia Commonwealth Attorney Association, towards a view of criminal justice that is more in line with our reform-minded view. And as Parissa said, not only are we going to push there, but I know I've made the commitment to personally go down as the Fairfax County Commonwealth Attorney and push on legislation that will better our communities, make more permanent what we're trying to do in our jurisdictions, regardless of what position VACA takes.
Can I just add to that what we've heard, and this is what we were talking about in the green room earlier, what we hear a lot of and what we all heard during the campaign was, well, as prosecutors, we're just ministers of justice and we just follow the law, which, going back, that wasn't, that wasn't the narrative that until very recently was told about prosecutors. But now with the reformers running, the narrative is, well, prosecutors just follow the law, and that's what they do. Their jobs are ministerial, and we're ministers of justice. But what they don't say and what they leave out is that they help shape the law, and that they were the ones who supported mandatory minimums. They were the ones who supported bringing the age of certification down. They're the ones who argued against having a mechanism to get back into court in Virginia if you were convicted based on completely invalid junk science. So, it's just disingenuous to say that we don't have a role in policy and that we don't have a role in making the laws. And I think that we are all, taking up that mantle and saying we shape the laws and we follow the laws. And let's not pretend like there's some entity that we have nothing to do with that's making laws that we, just have to blindly follow.
We have time for one more. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Daniela Cheslow, and I cover Virginia for WAMU. And I would love to hear from the 3 of you if you have ideas for reform regarding justice and undocumented immigration.
If I may. I think what we have to do is we have to, as we've just been talking about as far as working with the legislature and trying to figure out is what they will allow in certain regards as far as in what circumstances are the laws going to negatively impact somebody who is undocumented from a local perspective. And now, again, I'm speaking for my community, not for anybody else's. We as prosecutors have to take that into consideration because of this reason. One is that we have to look at what we said earlier. What was the crime that was committed? What was the harm to the community? And then what do we need to do to resolve or to do right by the community to be able to get compliance? A lot of times when we have some of these convictions, what might otherwise be a low-level offense might be devastating to somebody's ability to be able to remain in the country and be able to remain with their family, remain in their community, remain and be an active participant. So these are the things that, as a policy within our office, we are going to take into consideration. What are the consequences to immigration status? As far as having a bright line rule, I can't give that to you because every case really needs to have its own individual assertion as far as how it is going to be impacting that family. So we definitely going to have that as one of the considerations that when somebody's looking at what type of charging document to be issued or what type of charge to be asserted, and then what type of disposition, that those are things that we have to take into consideration.
I'll second that. It's one of the things that I want to do in my office is I want to have the prosecutors take a look at those issues, right? Because they're sometimes termed collateral consequences, but if they're affecting you and they're affecting your family, they are anything but collateral. They are of primary importance, and in many cases, those quote unquote collateral consequences are the things that are most important to someone in the criminal justice system. So being mindful of that is something that is incredibly important. I want to empower my prosecutors to do that and direct them to do that, because it's not only doing the right thing for that individual, it's actually an issue of safety for the community at large. Because what people need to understand is that when someone is afraid that if they're the victim of a crime or they see something and they're afraid to interact with the prosecutor's office or police because they're worried about immigration consequences, what that means is that they are not going to come forward and that crime is going to go unchecked. And eventually what will happen is you will create pockets of individuals who are essentially just victims waiting to be taken advantage of by nefarious people, and that drives down not only the trust in the community with law enforcement, but also the safety of the community as a whole. So taking a look at that is of something that is of primary importance to me, because it's not only a fairness and justice issue, but it's also a safety issue for the community as well.
So my answer is very similar to Steve's. I represent the entire community, whether you can vote or not vote, whether you're a child or whether you're an adult, whether you're incarcerated, a defendant, or a victim. I represent the entirety of the community. And it is important to me for the community to know that they will be safe if they report a crime. They will be safe if they've been a witness to a crime, and that they don't have to worry about their status. In terms of whether or not they're documented. And in order to do that, one of the policies that I'm going to have in place is that you do need to take into consideration the collateral consequences. Is this person going to be shut out of the primary job market? Is this person going to be deported or deportable? And just like any mitigating circumstance, this is something that needs to be considered.
Great. I've actually been told we have time for one more question. So,
hi, I'm Stephen Spitz from Fairfax County. Good to see you all. Jack over there passed out, Jack, Steve.
I do, and I worry for this question now because I know Jack.
Yes. I just want to read two sentences that I read last night and when we had a discussion on Virginia legislative matters. First sentence is, Virginia is one of only 6 states where juries not only determine guilt or innocence, but also the sentence and is the only one that does not give jurors the right to know what sentence they'll have to impose if they convict. The second sentence is the following. In Virginia, state funding for individual Commonwealth attorneys is determined in large part by the frequency of felony charges and convictions. Now, it seems to me that we have an enormous structural problem, and that what Parissa was saying earlier about being active in getting the structure of the criminal justice system in the state changed in this upcoming General Assembly should be a top priority of you all.
I would agree, and it's something that, you know, I think a lot of Commonwealth attorneys around the state have talked about. I know at a training we were at last week that was a topic of discussion. Because you're right, there is two big structural problems with that. First of all, paying prosecutors' offices and funding them based on the felony charges and the felony sentencing events that occur completely incentivizes more felonies, and it means that, quite frankly, as we make reforms that we've committed to making, we are going to lose money, right? Our funding is going to go down, which I know isn't going to stop me from doing the right thing. I don't think it's going to stop any of us from doing the right thing, but I know it could have a chilling effect in other jurisdictions. At the same time, some of the reforms that we are going to want to implement that make people's lives better take more resources than simply convicting someone and throwing them in jail. So we're getting squeezed on that twice. And I think the way that for many, many years a lot of the state got away with that being the system is that we've incentivized plea agreements, because with a jury making a sentence, that typically is the hammer. Look, you can take this plea right now, or you're going to go in front of a jury and you know what kind of sentence you're going to get from that jury. And that incentivizes people to just plea out and essentially move our quote-unquote justice system along quickly. That is a huge set of structural problems. I know it's something that I want to focus on, and I want to speak for my colleagues here, but I would be very surprised if that was not of concern to them as well.
I mean, it absolutely is. I as a juror, I would not want to go into a guilt or innocence deliberation without knowing what the sentence is going to be. And in fact, Arlington has tried marijuana possession cases and not told the jurors what the potential sentencing options are. The jury convicts, then comes back and asks the judge, what's the lowest sentence that we can impose? And the judge says a $1 fine. And so they impose a $1 fine. And so you're telling me that we just had like 5 hearings, you know, 5 court appearances over the course of a year. We ended up in a jury trial. We spent like a couple $1,000s bringing a jury in. People were like taking time off of work to come in. We picked a jury. They sat all day, and they convicted for a $1 fine. That jury would have nullified if they'd known that the lowest punishment was going to be a $1 fine. And I'm not suggesting that we should promote jury nullification, but I think jurors should know what they're going into, and they should also know that if they, that there's a mandatory minimum to one of the charges. I mean, I also think, like I said earlier, we should rethink the mandatory minimums, but I think that jurors should know in order to make an educated decision so that they don't feel like they've been sort of bamboozled in any way. And then you're absolutely right that it is a very perverse incentive structure upon which we get our funding. And that's true of a lot of different law enforcement. If you're going to give funding to sheriffs because of the number of bodies that they have in jail, and to police because of the number of arrests, and prosecutors because of the number of felony convictions and sentencing events, what you're doing is encouraging more financial and human cost. And then on top of that, the county isn't paying for people to go to prison, because then what we're doing is we're shifting the cost to the Department of Corrections, and we're shifting the cost to the state. And so the county doesn't even feel the impact of what the local law enforcement is doing. And I think John Paff talks about this a lot in Locked In. We need different metrics. I don't know what those metrics are, because what we're all doing and what we're all talking about is fairly new. And we haven't figured out how to do it, but we need different metrics, and we need metrics that reflect our values. You know, that diversion is more important than a felony conviction, and that, you know, putting resources into a restorative justice program that helps victims and survivors, but also reduces recidivism, because a person is taking active account, you know, is being held like actively accountable for their for the harm that they caused. Like, those are better for society, but, you know, if we can't get credit for what we're doing, you know, again, it's not going to stop us, but it will stop others, and it will make it unattractive for others to do.
If I may just close on that. You asked about as far as the jury and the information they get. In Virginia, when they, back in 1996, did away with parole, they called it truth in sentencing. It was hiding sentencing, because you didn't tell the jury anything. And if you have mandatory minimums, and we see that in the case, which sounds very serious, assault and battery on a law enforcement officer. And the assault and battery could be my touching the officer or punching him, right? So there should be maybe a jail sentence for the more egregious part. But if this is something where I nudged the officer as I was getting handcuffed, a lot of jurors may not want to give somebody incarceration time, but they have to give them a mandatory 6 months. And when you get a jury who comes back who is angry that they've been, you know, blocked by what they can do, and they're forced to give a mandatory minimum sentence, that, in my opinion, is not truth in sentencing. That really is, you are lying to the jury, because you haven't given them the full ability to be able to understand what their issues are within that community and how they value those offenses. So we do need to address the issues as far as mandatory minimums, because, no offense, Richmond doesn't know what the hell we're doing in Loudoun County. They don't know what's important to my community. So when they put in these mandatory minimums, my community may say, you know what, that really is not important to us. We would like to focus on other things. So why don't you give us the full sentencing range? Lastly, the other thing that we want to deal with in Loudoun County is being able to share with a jury what the true costs are for incarcerating somebody. Parissa said the cost, if it goes to Department of Corrections, is transferred over to Richmond and, you know, the state. But in Loudoun County, it's $66,000 a year for you to incarcerate somebody in my local jail. $66,000 is a lot of friggin' money. You better have done something pretty egregious for me to spend $66,000 on you. If you have possessed marijuana, you think I'm going to put you in jail for 30 days at $5,000? No, I got better things to do with my money. As I said earlier, from a business perspective, and I think that's how we may be able to educate the other communities who don't see it the same way, is by showing them what is the true cost. What is it costing our community in human resources as well as financial resources?
Great. Thank you all so much for coming. Thank you all so much for being here with me. This was really great, and I'll be around for a little bit if we want to keep talking. Thank you.
Thank you for having us.